Okay, hi everyone. So this is pretty much the talk I gave at the Euro conference a couple of months ago, so apologies if you've already seen it. But really it's talking about the work we've been doing recently, combining X-ray microtomography with acoustic monitoring in order to try to image this post-peak stress region of the stress evolution in rock deformation. So this is a constant strain rate experiment, and you can see here that this period where most of the damage happens, you have like accumulation of microcracking, and then you have this huge acceleration, and it all happens within a few seconds. And so previously, David Lochner and colleagues have managed to image this region with acoustic emission sources, and they did that by controlling the loading rate with the acoustic emissions feedback in order to maintain a constant rate of acoustic emissions. So they loaded at a constant strain rate. When they had enough acoustic emissions, they flipped into a feedback control, maintained the number of acoustic emissions constant, and that meant that the RAM on the rock was backing off in order to stabilize failure and avoid this kind of dynamic runaway crack, the rupture formation. And what they found was we have this distributed acoustic emissions at the beginning, and then they start to self-organize along a localized plane, and then as failure continues, this plane, they continue to localize along this plane, and this plane expands up across to become fully sample sized. And then, so if you compare this with a normal constant strain rate experiment, they showed basically that this initial loading phase is related to distributed microcracking, and then this peak stress region is related to this whole process of fault nucleation and propagation. And so we also have seen from in situ X-ray microtomography that a similar type of behavior. We've seen the formation of a shear band made of cracks. So these are all micro cracks segmented from the image data. And we've seen the propagation of a shear zone and then a failure. But we've also seen that damage can accumulate in a pattern that is pretty much unrelated to the eventual fault plane as well. And so what we've got here, this is peak stress and this is the post-failure, and what we've got here is a data gap, because the transition from stable crack growth to dynamic rupture happens way too quickly, even for fast synchrotron X-ray microtomography. So we decided to replicate the Lochner et al. Experiments in a synchrotron. And so what we needed to do was to build a X-ray transparent rock deformation cell with acoustic emissions monitoring. And this is based on an original design without the acoustic emissions by Ian Butler and other colleagues in Edinburgh. And so what we did here, we have our X-ray transparent pressure vessel with the sample inside. So this is the photograph, so this is here. And this is the Clashak sandstone sample that we used. And then we've got our acoustic sensors top and bottom. And we used only 2 acoustic sensors because this whole thing has got to rotate, and we can't really block the X-ray beam. So to try and triangulate X-ray sources, AE sources, was a little bit more of a challenge, and it's something that we're kind of thinking about as a kind of follow-on to this rig. But here we are. So we managed to monitor the acoustic emissions, and we also managed to control the acoustic emission event rate. So we can see here that this is the constant strain rate experiment I showed at the beginning. And then this is the AE controlled experiment. So we loaded it at a constant strain rate up until we had enough AEs to run the control, and then it flipped into AE rate control. And so we managed to extend failure from less than 3 minutes to just under an hour. So we've got this nice series of micro CT volumes that show shear band evolution, shear zone evolution. And so if we have a look here, what's going on? So we can see here that as we reach peak stress, then we see this shear band starting to localize, and there's an awful lot going on here in the microstructure. Here we've got a very high resolution. Here we've got 1 pixel is about 8 microns. You can't actually see the pixel size here, but what happens? I'll play that again. We start to see these an echelon tensile cracks localized along the shear band, and then this whole hanging wall, if you will, moves as one continuum relative to the footwall. So if we zoom in a bit, what's happening in the localized shear zone is that we're seeing these an echelon tensile cracks nucleating and then opening to produce volumetric strain. We're seeing that the shear movement of the hanging wall is actually accommodated in part by rotation of grains and cracks. And we also see sliding. So we see there's synthetic sliding. So we start to see grain boundary cracks forming here and some sliding this way. But then we also see, as we see grain fragments rotate, we start to see antithetic sliding. So in the opposite sense to the shear zone itself, along these grain surfaces. So we've got three mechanisms by which shear strain is accommodated, and then eventually we see that coherent slip occurs. So this whole hanging wall moves relative to the footwall along a kind of fault plane within this sort of protocataclysite region in the shear zone. And so we also did some digital volume correlation. So these are the 3D strain fields. Why are they not playing? Oh, they are playing. Okay, here we go. So this is the shear and the dilation strain. So this is around peak stress. Then you start to see the shear band propagate across the sample. And what we notice here is this, around peak stress is this kind of exploratory localization of candidate planes along which the sample might fail. And then it eventually chooses one and then propagates up and across the sample. And we also see that the shear and the dilatant strain are very correlated in terms of spatially and temporally, and also in terms of their amplitude. So they're both peaking at around the same strain. This is highlighted, it's actually 0.04, the actual maximum strain. We also see that the compaction is there. So this threshold doesn't highlight the diffuse compaction, but we see that there is a kind of high degree of compaction along the shear band once it's formed. And you can see here in these histograms, so distributions, that the compaction and the dilation start off fairly similar, and the same with the shear strain as we start the experiment. And then as peak stress occurs and we start to see increasing damage localization, we see an emergent fat tail in the shear strain and the dilation, which become bimodal and swamp the compaction. And as the shear band becomes sample width, we see a maximum in the strain intensity in the shear and the dilation. And then as it propagates down the sample and then starts to slide coherently, we see this strong relaxation of strain going on there. So we also looked at the acoustic emissions locations. So because we had only 2 sensors, we decided to use the strain fields as a prior. So we found from the 2 sensors, we found the relative time delay. Through the relative time delay, my colleague Mary Daphne, she identified a kind of bowl, a hyperboloid within the sample, along which that event was most likely to occur. And then within that bowl, we chose the maximum strain as the location. And because of the strong correlation between the shear and dilation, actually most of, I think like 80 or 90% of the events pretty much hit on the same location. So we use this kind of maximum strain constraint within the kinematic constraint of the relative time delay to locate our events. And you can see that we have some on the shear band and some not on the shear band. and of varying sizes. So if we now plot this, so this is the AE amplitude against the dilation and the shear strain at each AE event location. And actually, what we see is that the regions of high strain are actually correlated with smaller AE events. So within the shear band, we're actually seeing a lot of smaller AE events, whereas we've got a relative absence of large AE events in the high strain zones. So, so we've got this idea that the strain moment, the seismic moment is not necessarily representative of the strain moment. So, you know, this is quite a common assumption in operational forecasting of seismic risk, is that when you've got high seismic amplitude, you've also got high strain. And so we kind of show that this is not necessarily the case. And it also shows that within the shear band, we've actually got a significant proportion of aseismic strain as well. So I wanted to look a little bit into the shear fracture energy. So this is the energy required to break down intact rock in the shear zone. And Jim Rice showed in the 80s that it could be estimated from the shear stress relative slip curve, and that this could be calculated from the bulk stress and strain data. And so what I've done here is I've shown, and this model, so this is based on Barenblatt's cohesive zone model, and it assumes that there's uniform slip on the fault. So the fault forms as one unit, and then there's uniform slip along the whole thing, which we've just shown in the strain images is not totally the case. But here, the yellow line, this is the average bulk stress, the average estimates of shear stress versus relative slip from the bulk stress and strain data. This is a cubic spline from the varying data, from the high resolution data. And then this orange line is the same model, but it's actually only at the micro CT scan times. And the reason for this discrepancy between the two is that we actually see that by coincidence, when we're using the RAM to modulate the AE event rate, it's kind of moving backwards and forwards, and most of these CT scans actually corresponded to a backing off of the RAM. So we're actually seeing a little bit less stress for a given slip at those points. So I also looked at the local shear fracture energy. So the local relative slip I calculated from the shear and the dilational strain. So I took within the strain fields, I took just the shear band and as an object in the image, and then I estimated the relative slip from the dilational strain and the shear strain. And what we see is that the dilation contributes about 36% of the local shear fracture energy, and the pure shear strain contributes about 64%. But what we also see here is that there is between the green and the orange, there is still quite a discrepancy. So this is the local shear fracture energy, this is the bulk shear fracture energy, and this is only about 68% of the bulk strain. The bulk, excuse me, the shear fracture energy locally is only about 68% of the bulk shear fracture energy, and we also see that there's there's a smaller distance to failure than required locally than we see in the bulk. Excuse me. And so I wanted to know how we could account for these differences. We've got about a 32 to 50% bulk shear fracture energy that's not accommodated by local dilation or sliding in the shear zone. And so some of it will be dissipated off fault. So I looked at the on-off fault strain ratios, and we see that actually only 12% of the total strain is dissipated off fault. So we've still got around 20% of the bulk shear fracture energy not accounted for. So we thought it could be due to these rotational mechanisms, this grain rotation. And so I looked at individual cracks in the images and estimated the slip as the crack rotates from the cosine rule. And on average, I took 5 cracks, I think. They're big ones that showed the most rotation. And actually, we saw that they can be as large as about 77% of the total observed slip. So, I mean, that's very large, but on average, so if you've got all these other, if you've got these other sliding and tensile microcracking mechanisms occurring in the shear band, on average, you know, it is feasible that this rotation could account for this 20% of the remaining shear fracture energy. So I think that's me. That's to conclude. So basically, by combining sound and vision, we have confirmed previous inferences from acoustic emission sources, but we've also found a few new things. So we found that grain and associated crack rotation is a significant part of the evolution of the shear band. And we found that there's this kind of exploratory nature of strain at around peak stress, where we found several candidate shear zones along which the system was kind of choosing along which to fail. And we also found this idea that the local, the strain moment is not necessarily correlated with the seismic moment. Thank you very much.